Hey there, friends. Tonight, we're going to slow down, dim the lights, and step back to a time when life was a little rougher, a little colder, and a lot less predictable. Imagine a world where every meal was a small victory, and the coming winter meant more than just chilly days. It meant survival. No cozy kitchens, no supermarkets, just simple foods, hard work, and a lot of hope. Before we get too comfy, take a moment to hit like and subscribe if you're into this kind of deep dive into the past. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see how far and wide we go when stories like these start unfolding. Now settle in, maybe grab a blanket, or turn on that soft fan hum, whatever helps you relax. Because what we're about to explore isn't flashy or fast. It's slow, steady, and filled with the kind of quiet grit that kept ordinary people alive through the harshest winters. Imagine you woke up on a cold fall morning in a medieval village, the kind where you can see your breath the second you step outside and the ground has that early frost crunch. Winter isn't here yet, but you can feel it coming in the air, in the way people move, in how quickly the days seem to end. For peasants, this time of year wasn't just about colder weather. It was about preparing, getting food ready to last. Because once the snow started falling, survival got a lot harder. And that's what we're talking about tonight. What medieval peasants actually ate to survive brutal winters. No fluff, no royal feasts, just the real simple stuff that kept people going when the world outside froze over. In these early weeks, it was all hands on deck. Harvesting the last of the grain, barley, rye, oats, drying it out, storing it away. These grains were everything. Bread, porridge, whatever you could make stretch. Then came the root vegetables, turnips, onions, leeks. Not glamorous, but they lasted. The vibe was quiet, but focused. People weren't panicking. They were just doing what they'd done every year. Because they knew what you managed to stash now, that's what you were living off when the snow came. And if you had a pig, maybe a few chickens, you had to decide, keep them for eggs and milk, or butcher them and try to preserve what meat you could. They didn't have fridges, of course. Just old school methods we'll get into soon. So yeah, before we dive into how they made food last through months of cold and snow, this is where it all started. That final window of time before everything changed. Imagine this. You're deep into autumn. The air is crisp, leaves are turning, animals are growing quiet, and the sky turns gray earlier and earlier every day. And you know what that means? Winter is coming. Not in the TV show, exciting kind of way, but in the very real, very cold, very serious way. The kind where survival depends on the choices you make right now. Your fields are nearly bare. The garden is down to its final roots. The livestock that could be butchered has been. You can't waste anything. Not a single carrot, not a single piece of meat, not even the fat that melts off the cooking pot. Because if you don't preserve it now, if you don't think like someone trying to feed your family through months of ice, wind, and snow, there won't be enough. Preservation wasn't a side task. It was the quiet, constant background hum of medieval peasant life. Every meal you ate in January, every scrap you chewed on in February, had to be planned, prepped, and stored while the earth was still giving. Let's start with something you'd smell the moment you stepped into any peasant home in the late fall: smoke. Peasants didn't have fancy stone smokehouses. They had the same one-room huts they lived in, and that's where the food hung. Over the hearth, which burned low and steady for hours each day, meat would hang on ropes, hooks, or old beams overhead. Fish, pork, maybe even a rabbit if someone got lucky. The smoke slowly curled around it all, drying it out, sealing the outside with that bitter, oily layer of preservation. Sometimes it took days, sometimes weeks. The fire never really went out, because if it did, you lost heat and the meat. The smoke stung your eyes, made your clothes smell for days, coated everything in a thin layer of soot. But no one complained, because that smell? That was the smell of food security, of something lasting, of not going hungry by midwinter. Now, if you were lucky, and that's a big if, you had access to salt. Salt was expensive, yes, but it wasn't impossible. Peasants near coastal areas might gather it themselves. Inland, it could be traded in tiny amounts. When you had it, you used it like treasure. Salting meat was more than just rubbing it down. It was packing it into barrels, layering it between slabs of salt until the meat looked more like bricks than food. Days passed. Moisture got pulled out. Then you'd seal the barrel and store it in the coldest corner of your home. Or, if you had one, a small shed outside. The result? Meat that could last for months. Was it tasty? Not really. You'd boil it a few times to soften it up and still end up chewing like you were eating salted leather. But it kept you alive, and that's all that mattered. Next comes a slower method, pickling. You'd take whatever vegetables hadn't been eaten fresh, cabbages, onions, beets, and pack them into large clay jars. You'd pour over salted water, or if you had it, some sour ale or vinegar, then seal the top with cloth and wax. Slowly, over days, the brine worked its magic. Fermentation started. The flavor turned sour, sharp, a bit funky, but edible, safe. Pickled veg wasn't a side dish, it was the meal. You'd scoop out soft, vinegary cabbage and eat it with a crust of stale bread. Add a bit of broth, and it became soup. Pickling wasn't just a clever method. It was often the only way to keep vitamins through winter. Without it, scurvy and sickness were real risks. And of course, the root cellar. If you had a bit of land and enough hands to dig, you'd hollow out a space underground. Cool, damp, dark. Line it with straw, wood, maybe old cloths, and then start filling it. Carrots, turnips, onions, apples, even eggs sometimes packed in ash or brine. Each crop had its own trick. Apples needed air, potatoes didn't. Onions had to stay dry. Cabbage could be buried whole in a barrel of sand. It wasn't a fridge. It was more like organized earth, a space that used the natural chill of the ground to slow down decay. You check it weekly, rotate the food, throw out anything moldy. And if you were careful, you could still be pulling from that cellar in March, when the world outside was still frozen stiff. There were other tricks too, small ones, little medieval life hacks. You'd store eggs in lime water to keep them fresh, dry herbs by hanging them from the rafters, mint, thyme, wild garlic, to flavor the bland meals of January. Hard cheeses were wrapped in cloth and rubbed with ash or salt to keep out mold. Honey was sealed tight and lasted forever. And for some families, fat was everything. You'd cook something in lard or beef tallow, pour extra melted fat over the top, and let it harden. This created a solid, airtight cap. Inside the jar, meat, beans, or even mashed grains, safe from the air, safe from decay. When you needed food, you'd break through that layer of fat, scoop out what you needed, then reseal it. It was like the medieval version of Tupperware. Greasy, but genius. Then came winter itself, and the stretching began. Food wasn't eaten fast. It was stretched, thinned, watered down. One small salted ham could flavor a month's worth of soup. A bit of dried fish might get broken into crumbs and dropped into porridge, not for protein, but for the hint of flavor. Bones were simmered until they dissolved into jelly. Stale bread was soaked, mashed, and reused. Nothing, and I mean nothing, was wasted. Even spoiled food had second chances. You could scrape mold off cheese, boil sour milk into curds, fry rancid fat to drive off the worst smells. And if it made you sick, well, you took the risk. Because in February, when snow covered the garden and your breath froze in the air, you ate what you had, what you'd saved, what you'd smoked, salted, buried, or sealed, and every bite reminded you of autumn, of that final harvest, of your own hands, working day and night to prepare. Food preservation wasn't a convenience, it was a quiet kind of magic. A battle against time and decay, a way for ordinary people, with no fridge, no freezer, no plastic wrap, to outsmart the cold. And if you managed to make it to spring, with a little meat still hanging, a few jars still sealed, and something to plant again, that was victory. As the golden fields of late summer bent heavy with grain, and the last fruits clung stubbornly to bare branches, medieval peasants began the most critical phase of their year, preserving their food for the long, harsh winter ahead. Without modern refrigeration or any of our contemporary conveniences, the survival of entire families hinged on the wisdom, patience, and stubborn ingenuity of those tasked with keeping the harvest from rotting away in the cold months to come. Grain, the foundation of winter sustenance. Grain was more than just food. It was the backbone of medieval peasant diets. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats, once harvested, were carefully threshed to separate the edible kernels from the chaff, then winnowed to remove the lighter husks. But all this labor would be wasted if the grain wasn't properly dried and stored. Moisture was the greatest enemy of stored grain. Dampness invited mold, insects, and rodents, all eager to feast on the precious stores. Peasants went to great lengths to ensure the grain was as dry as possible before storage. Granaries, small, raised wooden structures, were common in villages with enough resources, elevated above the ground to prevent damp earth moisture from creeping in and to deter vermin. In less affluent homes, sacks woven from coarse linen or hemp held the grain. These were stored inside homes or in outbuildings, often placed on wooden racks or pallets. To further protect the grain, peasants packed moss, straw, or rushes around the sacks, hoping to buffer them against drafts and deter pests. The smell of dry straw mixed with the faint scent of grain was a familiar, comforting presence, a reminder that survival was within reach. Root vegetables, buried treasures. While grain fed the body, root vegetables fed both body and spirit during winter's depths. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and beets were hearty staples that thrived underground long after frost had settled on the surface. Peasants dug special storage pits lined with straw, often covered with wooden lids or thick layers of earth to protect against freezing temperatures. These underground caches maintained a near constant temperature just above freezing, slowing decomposition. Some households maintained cool, dark cellars beneath their homes, where these roots could be stored alongside barrels of salted meat or preserved fruits. The earthy aroma of damp soil, mixed with the sweetness of root vegetables, was a subtle reminder of life beneath the snow. The technique required constant vigilance, checking for rot, replacing straw, and carefully selecting only the healthiest roots for storage. Any rotten vegetable was quickly removed to prevent the spread of decay. Meat, the precious and perishable luxury. For most peasants, meat was a rare luxury, often reserved for feast days or special occasions. When they did slaughter livestock, preservation became a frantic, all-consuming effort. Fresh meat spoiled rapidly, in days, sometimes hours, especially during the warmer months. The arrival of cold weather offered some relief, but the threat of spoilage remained. Salting was the primary preservation method. Large quantities of coarse salt, expensive and often hard to come by, were rubbed deeply into cuts of pork, beef, or game. The salt drew moisture out of the meat, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. Once salted, the meat was hung in cool, dry places, often in smokehouses or near hearths, where the slow dance of smoke would further dry the meat and infuse it with preservative chemicals. This smoky aroma, thick and pungent, was as much a part of winter as the biting wind. Cold weather helped, but peasants understood that smoked and salted meat could last for months only if conditions were right. Too damp, and mold would creep in. Too warm, and rot would begin. This balance was delicate and crucial. Fish, a coastal and riverine lifeline. In villages near rivers, lakes, or the sea, fish was an essential supplement to the winter diet. Preservation methods for fish closely mirrored those for meat. Salted fish, particularly herring or cod, was laid out on drying racks exposed to the wind and sun during autumn, slowly becoming hard and dense. Dried fish could be stored for months, becoming a vital source of protein and flavor during the lean winter months when fresh meat was scarce. Some communities developed specific fisheries and storage customs around these practices. For example, salted fish barrels lined with oak or pine were stored in cool cellars, while dried fish hung from rafters in smoky kitchens. Dairy. The fragile gift milk was a seasonal luxury, and an unstable one at that. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled quickly. To preserve dairy, peasants transformed milk into products with longer shelf lives, butter and cheese. Butter was churned by hand, often during the late summer and autumn months when milk was abundant. It was stored in cool underground pits or buried in cold streams within sealed containers to keep it from spoiling. Cheese making was both an art and a necessity. Hard cheeses aged in cool cellars or caves could last through the winter, providing essential fats and proteins. Soft cheeses, fresher and more perishable, were consumed quickly. Fruits and herbs, fleeting flavors. Fresh fruits were rare in winter, but peasants found ways to keep their flavors alive. Berries and apples were dried on racks near hearths or in the sun during autumn, their sugars concentrating into sweet, chewy morsels. Preserving fruits in honey or sugar syrups was a luxury reserved for those with access to these costly sweeteners. These preserves were carefully rationed through winter months, enjoyed sparingly for festive occasions or medicinal uses. Herbs, vital for seasoning and healing, were dried and stored in bundles, hanging from rafters or tucked into wooden boxes. Fermentation, the ancient alchemy. Fermentation was a powerful, natural preservation method. Sauerkraut, made by fermenting cabbage, provided peasants with essential vitamin C, vital to prevent scurvy during long winters. Fermented beverages like cider or mead were both refreshing and preservative. Fermentation not only preserved food, but enhanced nutritional value and introduced beneficial probiotics, a medieval form of gut health care. The constant battle against decay. Despite all these methods, food preservation was a gamble. Mold, mildew, rot, and pests were relentless adversaries. Rats and mice were constant invaders, gnawing through sacks and stealing precious grains or dried fruits. Peasants resorted to creative methods, sprinkling certain herbs with insect-repellent properties, placing traps, or keeping cats nearby to control vermin. Every batch of stored food was inspected regularly. Rotting grain might be removed, dried herbs refreshed, smoked meats checked for mold. The fear of losing a winter's worth of food was a heavy burden. The rhythm of preservation and consumption preservation shaped the very rhythm of medieval life. Autumn was a time of frantic activity, harvesting, drying, salting, and storing. Winter was slower, quieter, a time of careful rationing and appreciation of what had been saved. Spring's arrival was celebrated as fresh vegetables and wild greens poked through the thawing soil. The survival of a family through winter depended not just on luck, but on the meticulous work of preservation, the steady consumption of stored foods, and the hope for a fruitful year ahead. In the end, preservation was survival. So when you imagine a medieval winter, think not only of bitter cold and sparse meals, but also of the patient, relentless effort to keep life going. Every salted ham, dried apple, and stored sack of grain was a small miracle, the product of generations of knowledge passed down through countless winters. These were the quiet victories, the backbone of survival in a world without modern comforts: hunting, foraging, and fishing. The lifelines of medieval peasants. Before the biting cold of winter fully set in and the snow draped the fields in white silence, medieval peasants turned to the forests, rivers, and wild lands surrounding their homes as vital sources of sustenance. These natural spaces were their secret pantries, places where food was gathered, caught, and hunted to supplement what the farm provided, especially as the harsh months approached. Unlike the lords and knights who enjoyed grand feasts and game meat, peasants had to rely on patience, knowledge, and a deep connection with the wild. The restrictions of hunting, laws and realities. It's important to start here. Medieval hunting was highly regulated. The right to hunt large game, stags, boars, hares, was reserved almost exclusively for nobility and those with royal or manorial permissions. Peasants caught hunting such animals risked severe punishments, ranging from fines to imprisonment or worse. This wasn't just about food control, it was about social hierarchy and power. But the restrictions didn't end there. Forests and woodlands were often royal forests, where strict game laws applied. These laws protected animals deemed game, and peasants could only hunt in certain areas with specific animals using allowed methods. So how did peasants get their share of meat? Small game hunting, patience, and ingenuity. Because large game was off limits, peasants relied heavily on hunting small animals. Rabbits and hares were among the most common targets. They also hunted squirrels, pheasants, partridges, ducks, and other small birds. Small game was much easier to catch but required patience and knowledge of animal behavior. Many peasants used snares, simple yet effective traps made from twine or thin ropes fashioned into nooses placed strategically along animal paths. These snares didn't require a hunter's constant presence and could catch rabbits or squirrels overnight. Snares and traps. Snare construction. Twine or strips of leather were looped into a noose and fixed to a stake or tree branch. When the animal passed through, its foot or neck would tighten the loop, capturing it without killing immediately. Pit traps. Sometimes, peasants dug shallow pits covered with branches and leaves. Small animals would fall in, trapped but alive. Deadfalls, heavy stones or logs rigged to fall when triggered by an animal's movement. These methods took cunning, knowing animal routes, burrow entrances, and favorite feeding spots. The role of dogs. A well-trained dog was a priceless asset. Peasant families sometimes kept small terriers or spaniel-like dogs that could flush out birds or rabbits from bushes, making hunting easier. Dogs could also track injured animals. Training dogs was a skill passed through generations, often informal but crucial. The emotional and practical impact of hunting wasn't only about food. It was about pride and survival. Bringing home even a small rabbit was cause for celebration and added valuable protein to the table. Peasants used every part of the animal. Meat was cooked or preserved. Pelts became clothing, hats, or blankets. Bones were crafted into tools or needles. Organs sometimes were eaten or used in remedies. In this way, nothing went to waste. Fishing, an underrated lifeline. If the village sat near rivers, lakes, or the coast, fishing was a critical supplement to diets dominated by grains and root vegetables. Fishing came in many forms and styles. Fishing tools and techniques. Hand lines, simple lines with hooks made from bone, metal, or thorn. Peasants might bait these with worms, insects, or scraps. Nets, woven from flax or nettle fibers, these were used to scoop fish from shallow waters or along riverbanks. Weirs, ingenious fish traps made by placing wooden stakes and brushwood in streams or shallow rivers to guide fish into narrow enclosures, making them easy to catch. Basket traps, submerged wicker baskets with funnel-shaped openings allowed fish to swim in but not out. Spearfishing, using sharpened wooden or bone spears to catch fish in clear, shallow waters. Ice fishing. In colder areas, peasants cut holes in frozen rivers or ponds and used spears or baited lines beneath the ice. Fishing was a slow, patient process, but often rewarded with fresh, protein-rich food, critical for winter months. Seasonal rhythm of fishing peasants timed fishing with the seasons. Autumn. Fish like trout and pike gained fat stores, making them tastier and more nutritious. Winter. While many fish slowed down, certain species congregated under ice holes where peasants patiently waited. Spring. Fish spawned in rivers, offering temporary abundance. Foraging. Nature's bounty in the wild. When fields were barren and barns emptied, wild foods became life-saving resources. What was gathered? Berries, blackberries, elderberries, raspberries, and rowan berries were gathered in late summer and early autumn. Nuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and acorns were picked and stored for winter snacking or ground into flours or porridges. Mushrooms. Varieties like morels and chanterelles were prized, but required expert knowledge to avoid poisonous ones. Edible greens. Nettles, dandelion, wild garlic, sorrel, and wild onions added flavor and nutrients. Roots and tubers. Wild carrots, parsnips, and burdock roots were dug up. Tree bark. In desperate times, inner bark of pine or birch trees was dried and ground into emergency flour. The risks and knowledge of foraging gathering wild plants wasn't without risk. Many berries and mushrooms were toxic or fatal if eaten. Knowledge was passed orally from parent to child, often accompanied by stories and warnings. Seasonal timing mattered too. For example, some berries were only edible after the first frost softened their acidity. The seasonal cycle. Living by nature's clock. Medieval peasants' lives were tightly woven into the rhythm of the seasons. Late summer to early autumn. A frantic period of harvesting wild foods, nuts, berries, mushrooms, before the first frost. Late autumn. Setting traps and snares became important as some animals grew more vulnerable preparing for winter. Early winter. Fishing beneath ice, hunting small game, and relying on stored and preserved foods. Mid to late winter. Fewer opportunities in the wild, increased reliance on stored provisions, and communal sharing. This rhythm was crucial. Missing a seasonal window could mean hunger or worse. The social aspect. Sharing the wild harvest survival often depended on community. Sharing was vital. Traps and nets might be communal property. Successful hunts were shared, especially with the elderly, sick, or children. Villages sometimes organized group hunts or fishing expeditions. Collective knowledge about safe foraging spots and edible plants circulated orally. This created a support network where everyone's survival was linked. Tools and technology used in hunting, fishing, and foraging. Peasants used simple, handmade tools crafted from wood, bone, and metal scraps. snares and traps made from twine or horsehair, fishing nets woven from flax or nettles, spears carved from wood with bone or metal tips, baskets woven from reeds or willow for carrying gathered foods, knives for cutting roots or cleaning fish, small leather pouches to carry foraged herbs or nuts. Regional differences in hunting and foraging. Geography and climate affected what peasants could hunt, catch, and gather. Northern Europe, more reliance on fishing and ice fishing, with emphasis on hardy root vegetables and preserved fish. Southern Europe, more diverse, foraging with olives, wild herbs, and Mediterranean fruits. Forested areas, abundant game and nuts, but risk of predators. Coastal villages, heavy dependence on fish, shellfish, and seaweed. Hunting taboos and spiritual beliefs. Hunting and foraging were sometimes wrapped in superstition. Certain animals were considered sacred or cursed. Some plants were linked to protective magic or healing. The success of a hunt might be attributed to rituals or offerings to forest spirits. This spiritual layer influenced how peasants interacted with nature. The harsh realities and dangers hunters faced dangers from wild predators. Wolves and bears roamed many forests. Harsh weather made fishing and foraging physically demanding and risky. Food scarcity could lead to desperate measures, such as eating tree bark or risking punishment by poaching forbidden game. Summary: in the end, hunting, fishing, and foraging weren't mere hobbies or occasional activities. They were vital strategies woven into the very fabric of medieval peasant life. These practices required patience, skill, knowledge of the environment, and a strong community spirit. The story of surviving brutal winters is a story of these small, steady victories: the caught rabbit, the gathered nuts, the fish pulled from icy waters, moments of hope and sustenance that kept families alive when the cold tried to claim them. Cooking techniques and tools of medieval peasants. The art of survival and simplicity. Cooking in medieval peasant households was nothing like the modern kitchen rituals we enjoy today. There were no stoves, no electric ovens, and certainly no fancy gadgets. Instead, what they had were open hearths, simple tools, and centuries-old methods passed down through generations. The challenge: transforming humble, seasonal, often limited ingredients into nourishing meals that could sustain them through harsh winters. Let's explore the full landscape, from tools to techniques, and the creative ways peasants made do with what they had. The hearth, the heart of the home. At the center of every peasant home stood the hearth, an open fire pit dug into the earthen floor or built with stones and clay. This wasn't just for warmth. It was the kitchen, the stove, and often the dining room all rolled into one. Fuel. Wood was the primary fuel, collected from nearby forests. Peasants knew exactly which wood burned best. Hardwoods like oak or ash provided longer-lasting fires, while softwoods like pine ignited quickly but burned fast. Fire management. Keeping a steady fire was a skill. Too hot and food burned. Too low and it barely cooked. Ashes were raked and reused to help control the heat. Smoke. Without chimneys in most humble homes, smoke curled through thatched roofs or tiny vents, filling the space with a smoky haze. It was harsh, but part of the atmosphere. Pots, pans, and cooking vessels. Medieval peasants had access to only the most basic cookware, often handmade from locally available materials. Clay pots. Earthenware pots were common. They were heavy, fragile, but held heat well. Pots were usually fired locally and could be glazed or unglazed. Iron cauldrons and kettles. If peasants could afford ironwork, they used heavy cast iron pots suspended over the fire by hooks or chains. These were essential for boiling water, stews, and soups. Wooden bowls and spoons. Plates were rare. Often people ate directly from wooden bowls or trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread. Spoons were carved from wood or bone, sometimes metal for those with means. Griddles and spits. Flat stones or iron griddles could be placed near the fire to cook bread or pancakes. A spit, a long rod, was used for roasting meat over the fire, often turned by hand or simple mechanisms. Cooking methods, simple but effective. Boiling and simmering boiling was one of the most common techniques. Peasants prepared stews, soups, and porridges by putting ingredients into pots filled with water or broth and heating them over the fire. Stews, thick mixtures of grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat or fish, cooked slowly to soften tough ingredients and blend flavors. Porridges, made from barley, oats, rye, or other grains, boiled into mushy consistency, a staple, especially for breakfast. Broths, used to extract flavor and nutrients from bones, vegetables, and herbs. Slow simmering allowed tough root vegetables and wild greens to become edible and digestible. Roasting was a luxury for peasants, since it required larger pieces of meat and more fire management. Spit roasting. When meat was available, often small game or occasional livestock, it was skewered on a spit and slowly turned over the fire for even cooking. Grilling. Flat stones heated near the fire doubled as grills for bread, fish, or vegetables. Roasting added a smoky flavor and a satisfying crispness to the food, but was usually reserved for special occasions or when game was caught. Baking bread, was a crucial skill. Communal ovens. Most peasants didn't have ovens at home. Villages often had communal clay or stone ovens where bread dough was brought and baked on specific days. Simple flatbreads. Peasants baked flatbreads or oatcakes on hot stones or griddles right in their homes. Dough ingredients. Bread dough was typically coarse, made from rye, barley, or oats mixed with water and sometimes sourdough starter. Wheat was rare and expensive. Fermentation. Some communities used natural yeast or sourdough cultures to leaven bread, though bread was generally dense and heavy. Tools of the trade. Everyday cooking implements. Knives and cutting tools. Peasants used simple iron or steel knives for preparing food, cutting meat, vegetables, and bread. Sharpening stones were used to maintain the edges. Bone or wooden tools sometimes supplemented knives for scraping or peeling. Grinding and milling grains had to be ground into flour for bread or porridge. Hand querns, small, portable grinding stones that peasants operated by hand. These were labor-intensive but crucial. Millstones, larger village mills were often powered by water or animals, where peasants brought their grain to be ground. Sieves, simple woven or wooden frames were used to sift flour, removing husks and coarser bits. Utensils, cooking wooden spoons for stirring pots and serving. Ladles, often carved from wood or hollowed-out gourds. Skimmers, made of woven reeds or thin wood to scoop out solids or fat from broths. Mortar and pestle, for grinding herbs, seeds, or small amounts of grain. Preservation, cooking techniques. Medieval peasants had to prepare food that could last through long winters. This led to special cooking and preservation methods. Smoking meat and fish were hung near the hearth to be slowly smoked, imparting flavor and extending shelf life. Smoke also deterred insects and slowed spoilage. Smoking was a slow process that required attention to the fire's smoke and temperature. Salting and pickling salt was a valuable commodity but used sparingly. Peasants preserved vegetables and fish by soaking them in brine or packing them with salt. Pickling vegetables like cabbage and onions extended their edible season. Drying and dehydrating. Thin slices of meat or fish were dried near the fire or in the sun. Herbs and wild greens were hung to dry for use in cooking or medicine. Grain was dried carefully after harvest to prevent mold. The flavor palette. Herbs, spices, and additives. Herbs from garden and wild peasants added flavor with whatever herbs they could grow or forage: parsley, thyme, sage, and rosemary if available. Wild herbs like nettles, wild garlic, chives, and mint. These herbs were used fresh or dried, added to stews, porridges, or breads. Spices, a rare luxury. Exotic spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves were expensive and mostly found in wealthy households. Peasants occasionally obtained small amounts through trade or market, but these were rare treats. Salt was the most common and important seasoning. Dairy and fats. Butter, lard, or rendered animal fat was used for cooking or greasing pots. Fat was precious for adding calories and richness to otherwise bland dishes. Cheese, often homemade and hard, was eaten fresh or aged. Meal structure and eating habits. Typical meals. Breakfast, often a simple porridge or leftover bread soaked in broth. Main meal, usually midday, consisting of thick stew or pottage made from grains, vegetables, and whatever meat or fish was available. Supper, smaller, lighter meal, often similar to breakfast or a simple bread and cheese combo. Meals were communal, eaten around the hearth with family. Eating without modern conveniences. No forks. Food was eaten with hands or spoons. Bread often doubled as utensils, used to scoop stew or soak up broth. Meals were simple, hearty, and eaten slowly to conserve warmth and energy. The challenges of cooking in cold weather water froze quickly, so cooks had to heat water constantly. Keeping food warm was difficult without modern insulation. Food preparation was laborious, especially when limited daylight hours forced early cooking. The role of women and children women were the primary cooks, managing firewood, fuel, and cooking. Children helped with gathering kindling, preparing ingredients, and fetching water. Cooking was a family affair, but the responsibility rested largely with women. Cultural and seasonal variations. Different regions had distinct ingredients and cooking customs. In wetter, colder areas, more boiling and stewing. Warmer climates favored roasting and drying. Seasonal foods dictated menus: roots in winter, fresh greens in spring. Anecdotes and daily life examples. Imagine a chilly autumn evening. The hearth fire crackles as a mother stirs a thick barley stew, tossing in handfuls of wild herbs. Outside, the wind rattles the thin walls. A child peels potatoes by candlelight while the father sharpens knives for tomorrow's small game hunt. A neighbor arrives with a freshly caught fish, still gleaming, ready for roasting. Meals were not just fuel. They were moments of comfort, ritual, and survival. Summary. The cooking techniques and tools of medieval peasants reveal a life of resourcefulness and endurance. From the smoky hearth to the hand-turned quern, from simple stews to communal baking days, every element reflected a delicate balance between necessity and tradition. It was a humble, gritty art, far from gourmet, but vital, sustaining, and deeply human. All right, let's keep settling in. You're lying back, the fan humming, maybe some ambient candle flicker in the background, and now we're diving deeper into the heart of medieval peasant survival. Food. Not just what they had, but what they made from it. Because when snow blanketed the ground and nothing fresh was growing anymore, winter meals weren't about taste. They were about scraping together whatever was left and making it stretch. And yet, in a strange way, these humble meals were beautiful, built on ingenuity, patience, and centuries of passed-down knowledge. Tonight, we're exploring the typical winter meals and recipes of medieval peasants, the stuff they ate when survival was the only goal and everything had to last, the dried, salted, smoked, pickled lifelines they worked so hard to store. So, imagine this: A winter morning in a peasant hut. You wake up under a threadbare wool blanket. The fire's long gone out, and the cold has crept in overnight. There's no rush to move. It's cold, and breakfast won't be much, but you need something warm in your stomach before you start your chores. No coffee, no bacon, no bread unless you're lucky. Your first meal? Maybe a thin porridge. Oats or barley, boiled in water. Sometimes goat's milk if the animal's still producing in winter, which wasn't guaranteed. If there's a sprinkle of herbs or a shred of cheese, it's a good day. This porridge, often called pottage in old texts, was the base of peasant meals, especially during winter. It was cheap, easy, filling, and endlessly adaptable depending on what scraps were left, the centerpiece of peasant cuisine. Pottage was more than food. It was strategy. A stew or porridge made of grains, vegetables, and occasionally bits of preserved meat or dairy. You could simmer it all day in a big clay or iron pot over the hearth. Each family had their own twist, their own version. A pot might contain dried peas or beans soaked overnight, onion, garlic, leeks, carrots, parsnips, turnips, hearty root vegetables stored in cellars, barley or oats for thickness, dried herbs like thyme, sage, or even stinging nettles, bone broth or water, sometimes a preserved ham bone for flavor. Pottage was often kept going over several days. They'd add to it as needed, reheat it, stretch it. Kind of like a medieval slow cooker that never really got cleaned out. You didn't waste food by making individual meals. Everything went into one pot, and everyone ate from it. Breads. When you could get them, bread in winter was rare and precious. If the family had grain, they'd take it to the mill to be ground, unless they had a hand mill of their own, which was rare for peasants. Flour was mixed with water, and maybe a bit of old sourdough if they had it. Yeast wasn't like what we know now. It had to be caught from the air, or from the foam of fermenting ale. They'd bake flatbreads on hot stones near the fire, or small loaves in clay ovens if they had one. A coarse, heavy bread, dark from husks and bran, dense and chewy. Some mixed in mashed peas or beans to stretch the flour further. Stale bread? That got dunked in broth. Nothing was wasted. Root cellars and the underground fridge. Most of the winter diet came from storage. Peasants used cellars, pits, and earthen mounds to keep food cool and dry. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, onions, garlic, parsnips, and cabbage were winter staples. They were easy to grow and could be buried or packed in straw to last. Cabbage especially. Tough, fibrous, and smelly, but incredibly nutritious. They'd cook it into stews or shred it raw with salt to make a kind of early sauerkraut. Fermentation kept it edible for weeks or even months, adding tang and preserving vitamin C. Dairy in the cold months' milk was scarce in winter. Animals didn't produce much, if anything. But cheese? That was another story. Hard cheeses made in summer could last all winter. Salted, pressed, and hung in cool spaces, they were crumbly, sharp, and strong-smelling. Not fancy, but dense with fat and protein. Peasants would shave off bits to flavor porridge or melt into pottage. Butter, if made, was stored in pots sealed with brine or buried to keep cool. Eggs? Rare in the cold months, but pickled eggs did exist, stored in jars with vinegar and spices if a family could afford the ingredients. Meat, preserved and precious meat, was rare for peasants, but even more so in winter. Hunting was mostly forbidden by law, unless you were poaching, which many did in secret. So the little meat they did have was preserved. Salted pork, cut into slabs, packed in barrels with thick salt, smoked fish or eels, hung in chimneys or smokehouses, dried sausages made from leftover cuts, blood, fat, and spices, these were kept for emergencies or special days. Most peasants didn't eat meat often, maybe a few bites chopped into stew to flavor a dish, or a bone boiled down for soup. Sometimes the family might have kept a chicken, more for eggs than meat. But come midwinter, that chicken might end up in the pot too. Sweetness, rare and special sugar didn't exist for peasants. Honey was a luxury, and fruit was either dried or fermented. But that didn't mean they had no sweetness. Dried apples, pears, and plums, like prunes, were stewed into warm fruit compotes. Peasants dried fruit on rooftops or string them up in kitchens. A winter dessert might be stewed apples with herbs, or baked root vegetables drizzled with a bit of honey if they had any, or maybe just roasted turnips, which turned sweet on their own. Recipes, oral tradition, not written. Peasants didn't have recipe books. They didn't write down exact measurements. Recipes were passed down orally. A pinch of this, a handful of that. Boil it till it smells good. Every household had their variations, depending on what the land and seasons gave them. Meals weren't fancy, but they were hearty, repetitive, and dependable. And in a world where you didn't know if the spring harvest would come in on time, dependable food mattered more than exciting food. Winter feasting, rare but real. Even in hardship, peasants celebrated. Holidays like Christmas or Candlemas were marked with communal meals. The village might slaughter a pig and share the meat. Ale flowed, the bread got thicker, and the stew might even include real chunks of meat, not just bones. These feasts were planned for, food saved, recipes remembered, everyone contributing. They were moments of brightness in a season of darkness. Summary of common winter meals. Morning, thin oat or barley porridge with a splash of goat's milk or shredded cheese. Midday, thick pottage of beans, root vegetables, herbs, and maybe bone broth. Evening, stale bread soaked in broth, dried fruit stew, or leftover pottage snacks, dried apples, hard cheese, rough flatbread with herbs. And through it all, these meals weren't just about nutrition. They were about routine, warmth, comfort, something familiar when everything else was frozen and uncertain. So next time you eat something warm and filling, maybe think about the long line of quiet resilience that came before you, and how, somehow, a bowl of pottage got people through the coldest nights in history. Now that we've had a look at what medieval peasants ate in winter, let's take a step deeper into what that food actually did, or didn't do, for them. Because surviving a medieval winter wasn't just about getting something in your stomach. It was about getting enough of the right things in a season that was almost perfectly designed to strip your body down to nothing. Cold, hunger, lack of sunlight, and hard labor. It all added up. So tonight, as we continue drifting back in time, let's explore the health and nutrition side of winter survival. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't balanced, but it worked. Sometimes, the nutritional puzzle of peasant life. In modern terms, we'd call the medieval peasant diet carb-heavy, protein-scarce, low in fat, and seasonally variable. Winter was the season when that imbalance hit hardest. Carbohydrates came from grains, barley, oats, rye. These were the base of pottage, porridge, bread, everything. Proteins were limited. Dried beans and peas helped, but meat and dairy were rare. Fats, essential for warmth and energy, were extremely scarce in winter. No olive oil, no butter in large quantities. Maybe a bit of animal fat, lard, or tallow when meat was preserved. Vitamins, especially C and D, were hard to come by. No citrus, no fresh greens, no supplements. This led to some big problems. Cold, calories, and energy burn. Peasants burned a lot of calories. Just staying warm was a full-body workout, and when you add daily chores, chopping firewood, hauling water, feeding animals, walking to town, carrying goods, repairing fences, it's no surprise they were often exhausted. But in winter, their food intake went down. No fresh harvest, fewer eggs, less milk. Meals got smaller, simpler. That created a serious energy gap. If you've ever skipped a meal and felt cold faster, that's exactly what happened to them. Low food equals low fuel equals more vulnerability to cold, illness, and fatigue. And they felt it every day. Malnutrition and deficiencies. Some of the most common problems peasants faced in winter were directly tied to micronutrient deficiencies. They didn't have names for these problems at the time, but their bodies still paid the price. Scurvy, a lack of vitamin C. Without fresh fruits or raw greens, peasants sometimes developed loose teeth, swollen gums, bleeding under the skin. Fermented cabbage helped if they had it. A rough proto-sauerkraut, but not everyone did. Rickets, a lack of vitamin D. Caused by no sunlight and limited dairy, children were especially vulnerable, ending up with weak bones and stunted growth. Anemia, from iron deficiency. A diet heavy in grains and low in meat caused pale skin, fatigue, shortness of breath. Protein deficiency, especially during long winters. This led to muscle loss, slow healing, and a weakened immune system. But here's the thing. Peasants were tough. Generations of hardship made their bodies adaptive. They didn't expect to feel good all the time. They expected to survive. And sometimes, just waking up without frostbite was enough of a win. Folk remedies and nutritional beliefs. Without modern science, medieval peasants relied on tradition and folk wisdom to protect their health. Some of it was surprisingly effective. Some, not so much. Garlic and onions were eaten for their warming, blood-strengthening qualities. Herbal teas made from nettles, yarrow, sage, or elderberry were used to chase the chill or prevent winter coughs. Ale and beer weren't just for pleasure. They were a safer hydration source than water, and the grains in them added extra calories. Bone broth, when available, was believed to strengthen the blood, and nutritionally, it actually did help with minerals and protein. Honey and vinegar were used in homemade tonics. A bit of sweetness, a bit of acidity, and a whole lot of belief. Peasants also believed in the hot-cold nature of foods, based on ancient ideas from Galenic medicine. Root vegetables were cold and moist. Onions were hot and dry. Meat was hot. Bread was neutral. Meals were built to balance the humors, even if they didn't understand the real nutritional science. How children and the elderly fared winter was especially hard on the very young and the very old. Children needed more energy for growth, but had smaller stomachs and less stored fat. They got cold faster, fell sick easier, and recovered slower. Elderly villagers, if they made it to old age, were at serious risk of hypothermia, weakness, and chronic malnourishment. Many deaths happened during winter nights, quietly during sleep, simply from lack of warmth or strength. It was common for families to sleep in groups, all together in one bed or on a shared mat, partly for body heat, but also to keep an eye on the fragile ones, seasonal sickness, and winter wasting. The medieval winter didn't just bring snow, it brought sickness, colds, flus, pneumonia, and a general wasting away. Not only were people nutritionally vulnerable, but homes were drafty, damp, and overcrowded. With fewer daylight hours, some peasants may have suffered from what we now call seasonal affective disorder. Though of course it had no name back then. Depression, low energy, irritability. They just called it melancholy and tried to work through it. And when one person got sick, it spread fast. There were no real quarantines, no doctors. Sometimes No remedies beyond a prayer, a herbal poultice, or keeping the fire going. The role of ale, fermentation, and drinking calories. One of the smartest things peasants did, knowingly or not, was use fermentation to stretch their nutrition. In the winter, when food was low, drinkable calories helped fill the gap. Ale and small beer had carbs, trace vitamins from yeast, and were much safer than cold, muddy water from a frozen well. Fermented cabbage and pickled roots retained vitamin C and gave the gut something to chew on. Sourdough bread had more bioavailable nutrients than raw flour. Fermentation helped break down the phytic acid in grains. Even their basic food prep was doing quiet, invisible nutritional work. Rest, recovery, and living with less. One small advantage peasants had in winter: less daylight meant less labor. Not that it was restful, but when the fields were frozen, there was less to do outside. That allowed more time inside, around the hearth. Families mended clothes, prepared tools, told stories, and simply existed. Winter was a time of slowing down, out of necessity, and that forced rest probably helped some bodies hang on longer than they otherwise could. In summary, a quiet fight for survival. So when we talk about health and nutrition in medieval winter, what we're really talking about is adaptation. Of bodies, of habits, of communities. They didn't have vitamins, but they learned how to make food last. They didn't understand protein, but they knew which foods gave strength. They didn't track calories, but they knew when they were running out. And somehow, even with all the odds stacked against them, enough of them survived. Year after year, century after century. Because for medieval peasants, health wasn't about wellness, it was about holding on. One mouthful at a time, one sunrise at a time. So far, we've talked about the food they ate, the tools they used, and how they tried to keep their bodies warm and functioning through months of biting cold. But now, let's shift into something even more subtle, and, in some ways, even more important. Let's talk about the mental and emotional survival of medieval peasants during winter. Because as heavy as hunger could weigh on a body, loneliness, hopelessness, and fear, they were often just as deadly. So tonight, with the fire crackling quietly in your mind and that blanket pulled just a little tighter, imagine this: a winter that doesn't end for days, a darkness that stretches out for months, and nothing but your thoughts and routines to keep you from drifting too far inward. The season of stillness, the psychological toll of winter. In many parts of medieval Europe, winters were long, not just in temperature, but in light. Sunlight became a rare visitor. Days were short, skies were gray, and nights, they swallowed everything. This wasn't just inconvenient. It was emotionally brutal. No clocks, no calendars, just vague markers of time, like the first frost or the feast of St. Lucy. Every day looked like the one before, and it was easy, dangerously easy, to lose track of time entirely. For many peasants, winter brought a kind of quiet dread. The harvest was over. The fields were dead. The animals were thin and tired. There was nothing new, no color, no song, just repetition, waiting, surviving. Some historians call this seasonal melancholy. Others have called it the wintering of the soul. Loneliness, isolation, and the pressure of silence. Medieval peasant villages were often tight-knit, small groups of a few dozen to a few hundred people. But in winter, isolation grew. Travel was dangerous. Roads became impassable. Neighbors stayed indoors. The sounds of life, children playing, animals grazing, hammers pounding, faded. You could go days without speaking to anyone outside your home. And if your home only held 2 or 3 people, or if someone fell ill, the silence could grow unbearable. For older peasants who had lost spouses or grown children, winter often brought painful memories. Empty chairs, quiet hearths, a stillness so deep it felt physical. And for children, the ones too young to understand the hardship, winter sometimes meant fear, shadows in the corners, whispered arguments between tired parents, hushed prayers, and a constant sense that something bad might happen at any time. Storytelling, superstition, and the human need for meaning. But peasants weren't helpless in the face of all this. They had a secret weapon, one we still use today: stories. Winter was storytelling season. Long nights by the fire gave space for tales of saints and sinners, lost kings, hungry wolves, enchanted forests, and clever foxes. These weren't just entertainment. They were anchors, ways to keep fear at bay, ways to pass on lessons, and sometimes ways to explain things that felt too big to understand. If a child died in the night, if a cow refused to give milk, if a sudden fever struck the family, stories filled the gaps that science hadn't yet reached. The spirit of winter has passed through. A saint is testing us. The house needs to be blessed again. In those beliefs, even the superstitious ones, there was comfort, because meaning, even if imaginary, is often more valuable than cold facts when you're trying to survive. Rituals and rhythm, mental survival through routine. Routines were everything. Daily life in winter might seem boring by modern standards, but for peasants, routine was mental armor. Wake before sunrise, stoke the fire, say a prayer, feed the animals, mend clothing, prepare a simple meal, check the roof, spin wool, sleep early. It didn't matter that many days looked identical. That predictability was the point. When your world is small and cold and quiet, a dependable rhythm is what keeps the mind from spiraling. Peasants might not have called it mindfulness, but that's what it was. Living in the present, focusing on the task, repeating slowly, day by day. Faith as an emotional lifeline. We can't talk about mental survival without talking about faith. Religion was the thread that tied most medieval lives together, and in winter, that thread became a lifeline. The church calendar gave structure. Advent, Christmas, Candlemas, Lent. Prayers gave voice to silent hopes and fears. Icons, relics, and symbols became focal points for comfort and strength. Even the act of lighting a candle in the dark had spiritual weight. It wasn't just about light. It was about protection, blessing, and hope. Peasants believed that saints walked among them, that angels listened, that their suffering had meaning, that faith didn't erase the cold, but it helped carry the mind through it. Humor, music, and the power of escapism. Believe it or not, laughter played a role too. Peasants told jokes, dark ones, silly ones, word games, rhymes, anything to pass the time, anything to keep the shadows at bay. Music also helped. Simple songs sung quietly indoors. Lullabies, work chants, seasonal carols, sometimes accompanied by crude instruments, flutes, lyres, pipes made from bone. In that music, in that shared breath, there was release. You didn't have to think about your empty pantry or your frozen floorboards. You could just exist, in rhythm, in harmony, even for a few moments. Emotional support within the family unit. Winter was the season of closeness, not just for heat, but for connection. Families bundled together for warmth. Children clung to parents. Spouses leaned on each other. Grandparents passed down stories. Siblings fought and made up. Even if tensions rose, and they did, families often found comfort in simply not being alone. To hear another voice, to share a glance, to hold a hand near the fire, to speak aloud just to feel heard. These bonds, frayed and imperfect though they were, kept minds tethered to something real. Mental collapse and quiet despair. And yet, not everyone made it through with their spirit intact. There were stories of peasants who wandered out into the snow and never came back, of mothers who stopped speaking, of old men who simply lay down and refused to rise. We'd now recognize this as depression, perhaps grief, perhaps even mental breakdown. But back then, there were no names for it, no help, no counselors, just the quiet slipping away of someone's will to keep going. Sometimes the body could survive, but the mind could not. And yet, for everyone who fell, another held on, quietly, bravely, relentlessly, the mind as the final hearth. In the end, the mind was the final hearth. When the fire in the fireplace died down, when the wind howled outside, when the last crust of bread was shared, what was left was thought, memory, hope, prayer, love, dreams, remembering a warmer season, hoping for a gentler spring, believing that hardship had meaning, dreaming of something better, even if only for your children. That's how they made it through. Not by strength of body alone, but by the quiet, stubborn strength of the mind. Let's say it's January. The sky has been gray for days. The snow outside is hard-packed and ice-crusted, the color of bone. And inside, the fire burns low again. You've used up your driest wood. The good herbs are gone. And in the corner of the single-room cottage, someone is coughing. Not just tired coughing. That kind of coughing. Wet, weak, rattling. You've heard it before. Now, let's talk about what it meant to care for the sick and the elderly during the bitter winters of the medieval world. And when that care failed, when someone finally slipped away, how death came quietly, what burial looked like, and how grief itself tried to find a place in the frozen ground. Fragility in the cold. Who was at risk? Let's be clear. Winter was dangerous for everyone. But for the sick and the old, it was a loaded gun. Children under 5 and adults over 60 were the most vulnerable. But anyone with a lingering illness, a bad injury, or a weak constitution might not survive to spring. Pneumonia wasn't a medical term yet, but everyone knew chest sickness. Fevers came and went with terrifying speed. A simple cut in summer, a nuisance in winter, a death sentence if it turned septic. And the old, those who'd survived dozens of winters before, sometimes just didn't have the strength for one more. The body slows in cold, appetites fade, blood pulls away from the skin, and when there's not enough food to fuel the immune system, even minor illnesses become wolves at the door. Peasant medicine. What did they do? There were no hospitals, no thermometers, no antibiotics, but medieval peasants still cared for the sick with everything they had, even if everything was a bundle of old herbs and a whispered prayer. Herbs and remedies. By winter, most fresh herbs were long gone, but the wise ones, the old women and the hedge healers, knew to dry and store certain plants, yarrow and elderflower for fevers, comfrey and plantain for wounds, garlic and onion poultices pressed against the chest for coughs. Honey, if they had it, was precious and healing. These weren't miracle cures, but they were acts of love. A damp cloth pressed to the forehead, a hot stone wrapped in cloth and placed by cold feet, a slow spoon-fed mouthful of gruel laced with sage or thyme, warmth and position. Keeping a sick person warm was both critical and nearly impossible. They'd be moved closest to the hearth, covered with every spare tunic, every old blanket, every stitched-together hide, sometimes surrounded by warmed bricks, or even nestled next to a goat or sheep for body heat. If the person couldn't sit upright, which was believed to help the lungs, someone would prop them up. Even if your knees ached, even if you hadn't slept, you sat, you watched, you listened to every ragged breath, because in a world where there were no emergency services, you were the only nurse they had. Caring for the elderly. Dignity in a harsh season. Elderly peasants, especially those with no children or surviving kin, faced uniquely bitter winters. Joints seized in the cold, eyes dimmed, memory faltered, and strength, if they had any left, drained quickly in the quiet months. Still, elders held a sacred place in most peasant households. They were memory keepers, story holders. Grandmothers passed down herbal knowledge. Grandfathers remembered the land before the last famine. So when winter came and their bodies gave out, families did what they could, kept them close to the fire, gave them the softest food, let them rest, let them speak. Sometimes they would talk for hours, not out of confusion, but out of urgency. They knew the darkness was coming, and they wanted to leave something behind, a tale, a recipe, a warning. In this way, care for the elderly wasn't just physical, it was cultural preservation. Even if they couldn't save the body, they tried to save the wisdom. When death came quietly, or not eventually, no matter how many hands cared, some didn't survive. Sometimes it was sudden, a fall on ice, a cough that turned fatal overnight. Other times, it was slow, a weeks-long fading, a hunger that never came back. And death in winter came with complications. The ground was frozen. The priest might be snowed in. The shroud might be old linen, half moth-eaten. And mourning had to compete with survival. You couldn't stop for long, not with mouths to feed, not with wood to chop, not with storms still rolling in. And yet, even in the hardest conditions, most communities tried to make space for ritual, burial in the cold months. Digging a grave in frozen earth was grueling. Sometimes it took a full day. More than one grave might be dug at once to prepare. If the ground was too hard, bodies were temporarily stored in barns, in caves, or even beneath churches, until the thaw. Shrouds were reused if possible. A wooden cross was the only marker, unless the family had coin for a carved stone. Most peasant burials were simple. A handful of dirt, a prayer, mumbled or chanted, a final goodbye. Children might not be allowed to attend. It was considered too much or too dangerous in the cold. And then life resumed. Someone had to take the sick one's chores. Someone had to tend the animals. There was no time for long grieving. But grief happened anyway. At night, at the fire, in silence, in the way someone would glance toward a now empty sleeping space and pause. Spiritual beliefs around winter death. Death in winter was seen as symbolic. It was a season of endings, but also in Christian belief, a season of waiting. Just as the earth slept, so too did the soul. Just as spring would return, so too would resurrection. For peasants, these beliefs brought peace. They imagined their loved ones warm in the next world, freed from pain, free from frost. In some regions, small tokens were left with the dead: a carved cross, a piece of cloth from their tunic, a sprig of dried herb for scent or symbolism, and the living prayed, every night, sometimes every hour, because if they were to survive this winter, they wanted to believe their loved ones did too, in some other place, some warmer place. Grieving while surviving. There wasn't always time for full mourning, but that didn't mean it didn't happen. Some whispered to the wind. Some sang old songs quietly while mending. Some took on the habits of the dead, a cloak, a way of speaking, a daily ritual, and kept them going. This was how memory stayed alive, not with grand memorials, but with gesture, habit, everyday reverence, caring, dying, remembering, a cycle that never stopped. Winter took people. It always did. But what matters is how the living responded, with care, with kindness, with the best they had, even if it wasn't much. They wrapped aching bodies in threadbare wool, held hands through fever, lit candles against the dark, dug graves with numb fingers, and whispered names into the wind. In this way, care continued, even through death, even in the frost, because even when they didn't have enough to eat, even when their own health was fragile, peasants looked after each other. It was hard. It was heartbreaking. It was life. Let's step back now. Let's leave behind the frostbitten fields, the flickering hearths, the cold mornings with aching hands, and the long nights spent whispering stories in the dark. Let's come back to now, to here, you, sitting in warmth, most likely, a roof overhead, maybe headphones on, a screen, a sofa, a fridge full of food not so far away. But even across that distance of time and comfort, something lingers, something from their world is still speaking. So, what did they leave behind, those quiet people of the past? What lessons do the cold seasons of their lives still offer to us, here, in ours? Let's take a moment. Let's let it breathe. Let's listen. Resilience isn't loud. We often think of resilience as dramatic, shouting into the storm, triumphing against odds, winning. But the kind of resilience that medieval peasants knew wasn't about winning. It was about lasting, enduring. It was quiet. It was waking up on the coldest morning and feeding the animals before your fingers could move. It was burying a child and still lighting the fire that night. It was surviving on turnips and dried beans, not because you wanted to, but because that's all there was. It was watching a loved one fade by the hearth and knowing you couldn't save them, but staying, holding, comforting anyway. Resilience, for them, didn't look like strength. It looked like showing up again and again, no matter how much was missing. There's something in that for us, that maybe strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stays. Simplicity has power. Today, we are surrounded by abundance of things, of information, of noise. But the people of those cold winters lived in radical simplicity, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And yet, somehow in that small world, every meal mattered. Every warm blanket meant something. Every tool, every bowl, every candle was cared for, not tossed away. A single apple, kept over winter, was a kind of treasure. What would it be like to value the simple again, to notice the hot tea in your hand, to feel the weight of your coat and say thank you, to look around and realize that even when life feels empty, it's still so full. Simplicity teaches gratitude, and gratitude makes even the coldest nights feel warmer. Community is everything. Winter was not meant to be survived alone. Even in the smallest hamlets, in the remotest huts, people leaned on each other. They traded food. They shared news. They gathered when someone fell sick. They dug graves together. They had no choice but to be there for one another. Today, our homes are better insulated, our lives more independent, but loneliness still freezes the spirit. We need each other, still, not just in crisis, but in quiet, ordinary ways, checking in, sharing stories, offering help, and learning to accept it, sitting together when there's nothing to say, when the world feels cold, even metaphorically. It's the people around us who become the firelight. The warmth we share is survival. That hasn't changed. Routine is a kind of sanctuary. For medieval peasants, winter routine was sacred, not because it was easy, but because it was safe. You rose at dawn, you gathered fuel, you fed the animals, you cooked, you mended, you prayed. Each day might look like the last. But in that repetition, there was rhythm, and in that rhythm, there was life. In the coldest times, routine gave meaning. And maybe today, when the world is loud and fast and constantly shifting, we forget that repetition is not a failure. It's not stagnation. Sometimes it's a lifeline. Making your bed, walking the same block, preparing your favorite comfort food, writing, stretching, sitting in quiet for 10 minutes. These are small acts. But in winter, literal or emotional, small acts become shelter. Endurance isn't just physical. We talk a lot about physical survival. But what about emotional endurance? Winter, especially in the past, tested the heart. You couldn't stop the storms. You couldn't always save the people you loved. You couldn't even guarantee you'd see the first buds of spring. But you could choose to keep hoping. Hope that tomorrow might be better. Hope that the food would last. Hope that someone would recover. Hope that your story, your tiny, quiet story, meant something. And it did. Because every peasant who endured the long dark passed something on. To a child, a village, a tradition, a prayer. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. Because someone, centuries ago, didn't give up. Hey again. If you're still here, still listening, that means you've stayed with me through the long, winding path of winter in medieval times. And that alone is something kind of special. So, thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. And thank you for caring about stories like this. Because what we've shared tonight wasn't just about salted meat and smoky hearths. It wasn't just about straw floors or foraging through snowy woods. What we've been talking about is something much deeper, something ancient. Survival, yes, but also connection, resilience, and the quiet courage that lives in all of us. It's easy to think of history as something cold and far away. It's easy to imagine medieval peasants as people so distant from our modern world that we can't relate, like characters in a storybook, not real people with real pain and real joys. But if you've listened closely tonight, you've probably realized they weren't that different from us. They had bad days. They had cold hands and empty bellies. They worried about their children. They looked at the sky and hoped it wouldn't snow again too soon. They whispered to each other late at night, huddled under itchy blankets, wondering what tomorrow would bring. And sometimes, they just sat in silence and let the fire do the talking. That's what makes their story worth telling. Not because it's dramatic, not because it's heroic in some flashy way, but because it's real and quiet and deeply human. Their lives were made of the same stuff as ours: worry and warmth, hardship and humor, work and wonder. And through all of it, especially in the hardest times, they endured. They endured, not because they were invincible, but because they had each other, because they passed down skills, wisdom, old stories, and older songs. Because even when food was scarce or fires burned low, they made do. They adjusted, they adapted, they survived, with grit, with humor, and with a kind of tired, quiet pride. And what a thing that is, to think that we carry some of that inside us, even now. Maybe not the exact knowledge of how to salt fish or dig roots from frozen ground, but the instinct, the will, the ability to make it through. Sometimes I wonder if that's why these stories still matter, not just for the facts or the trivia, but for what they awaken in us. the reminder that we're part of something long and strange and beautiful, a chain of survival that stretches back farther than we can imagine, a line of people who kept going, even when they weren't sure how. We've come a long way since then. We have central heating, grocery stores, hot showers, and thick blankets. But winter still comes for all of us, in different ways, not always with snow and ice. Sometimes it comes as loneliness, or grief, or exhaustion. Sometimes it's not outside our homes, but inside us, the kind of winter that doesn't show up on a weather map. And in those moments, when things feel heavy or frozen or uncertain, maybe there's something comforting in remembering the peasants we met tonight, the people who faced the cold year after year without asking for sympathy, just doing what had to be done, not giving up, not giving in, just enduring, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a song, sometimes with nothing but silence and the flicker of a dying fire, but still enduring. That's not a grand legacy. It's not etched in stone, but it's one worth honoring, because it's one we still live every day. And if you're here now, maybe curled up in bed or resting on your couch, maybe watching the sun come up or the stars drift by, I hope you take a moment to feel just how strong that makes you, even if you're tired, even if things feel messy, even if you're not sure what your next step is. You're still here, still listening, still holding on. That matters more than you know. So as this story closes and the night settles in, I want you to remember something simple. You don't need to be loud to be strong. You don't need to be perfect to be worthy. And you don't need to have all the answers to keep going. Sometimes just surviving is enough. Sometimes it's everything. So let yourself rest now. Let the echoes of ancient fires warm the corners of your thoughts. Let the knowledge of those quiet souls, the ones who came before us, settle into your bones like a lullaby. They made it, and so will you. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight. Wherever you are, whatever you're facing, I hope you sleep deeply. I hope you feel safe. And I hope you wake tomorrow knowing you are part of something vast and beautiful and very, very human. Until next time, good night.